How shall I begin to tell the deeds wrought by these nefarious men? Alas, the images which ought to have been adored were trodden underfoot. In the alleys, in the streets, in the temples, complaints, weeping, lamentations, grief, the groaning of men, the shrieks of women, wounds, rape, captivity, the separation of those most closely united. Nobles wandered about ignominiously, those of venerable age in tears, the rich in poverty. Thus it was in the streets, on the corners, in the temples, in the dens, for no place remained unassailed. All places everywhere were filled full of all kinds of crime. O immortal God, how great the afflictions of men, how great the distress.
This was the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the queen of cities laid waste by the marauding hordes of a Latin crusade. Today we'll be finding out why this city was taken to pieces by marauding crusaders in that fateful month of that fateful year in 1204.
Our story begins with the inauguration of a new pope. The year is 1198, and an aspiring young cardinal, Lotario de Conte de Signy, is inaugurated as Pope Innocent III. This is a pope who wants to make a difference. Innocent's papacy became defined by his desire to reform the church and to increase the power of the papal curia over the kings of Western Europe. What better way to do this than to promote the cause of crusading? After all, the First Crusade had seen large numbers of fighting pilgrims make their way to the Holy Land under the spiritual leadership of the papacy. The Second and Third Crusades had been somewhat less successful, but Innocent was determined that a new call to crusade would stimulate the nobility in the West to fight against the enemies of the Church. In Europe, this call was to be directed against the Cathar heretics of southern France. In Spain and in the East, the call was made to renew the fight against Islam. As Innocent's call to crusade percolated across the fields of France, one young nobleman, Tybalt the Count of Troyes, received the call with enthusiasm. He, after all, was the younger brother of Henry of Champagne, a Frenchman who had been the titular ruler of Jerusalem until 1197. He was also the nephew of the French king, Philip Augustus, who had been one of the leaders of the Third Crusade. Another leader of the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart, had suggested that a naval attack on the Islamic world in Egypt, rather than a long expedition across land to Jerusalem, would be the best way of achieving success on a further crusade. Thus, in 1201, 6 knights from Tybalt's retinue went off to the city of Venice, the largest maritime power in Western Europe, to secure passage for the thousands of soldiers that were expected to join the crusade. The ruler of Venice was the Grand Doge Enrico Dandolo, an old man of immense significance and commercial power in the medieval world. He was already 84 years old at the time of meeting the Crusaders. However, he was still able to strike a deal that would ultimately prove immensely beneficial for the Venetians. It was agreed that passage would be arranged for almost 40,000 Crusaders. The Venetians would provide over 50 war galleys, but would receive full payment and half of any territories that were to be conquered once the crusade reached Egypt. All they had to do now was wait. And wait they did, a whole year. However, only 1/3 of the expected crusaders turned up to board the ships in Venice. Once it was clear that the destination was to be Egypt rather than Jerusalem, it seemed as if enthusiasm for the enterprise had died. What's more, the leader of the crusade, young Tybalt, had also met an unfortunate end in 1201, leaving another nobleman, the Marquis Boniface of Montferrand, in charge of the crusade. A more pressing problem, however, was that there was nowhere near enough money to pay the Venetians. But the elderly Venetian Doge had a cunning idea. Why not attack the city of Zara first? The city had, after all, rebelled against the Venetians a year earlier. Sure, it was under the protection of the Pope, and was in fact Catholic, But surely that would not harm the overall purpose of the crusade on its journey to the east to go and fight against Islam. Sure enough, the Venetian fleet, with the Crusaders on board, left the harbour of Venice in October 1202. By November of the same year, after a great pounding by siege engines, the city of Zara was taken. The Doge was pleased. The Pope was furious.
When Elizabeth III heard that the Fourth Crusade had sacked the city of Zara, which was run by the King of Hungary, a fellow Catholic, he was enraged and he excommunicated the entire expedition. Now the crusade was becoming increasingly in the hands of the Venetians, to whom the Crusaders owed a huge sum of money, and the Venetian leader, the aged Doge Enrico Dandolo, was increasingly gaining a position of prominence among the Crusader leadership. To Innocent III, however, like a good Turkish coffee, this crusade was becoming increasingly bitter.
But now there was to be yet another twist in the tale of this Fourth Crusade. While the Crusaders were attacking the city of Zara, a young Byzantine prince had approached its leaders looking for help. The young man's name was Alexius, and he had been living in exile ever since his father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup. A pretender to the Byzantine throne, also confusingly called Alexius, had taken over, and was currently sat in the emperor's throne in Constantinople. Alexius in exile was determined to get him out. The Crusaders might very well give him that opportunity, but what would be in it for them?
The city of Constantinople itself was a place of immense beauty. It was home to hundreds of Christian relics and a place of pilgrimage for many. But there was also a certain amount of instability here, and you can see the number of rulers that Constantinople, the Byzantine capital of the Byzantine Empire, went through in the space of just a few years. And this is one of the underlying causes that really contributed to its fall in 1204.
In return for placing him on the throne in Constantinople, Alexius promised financial support for the Crusader invasion of Egypt, 10,000 soldiers of his own for the crusade, and that the Church of Constantinople would submit to the authority of Rome. The offer was too good to be true, and both the Venetian Doge and the Crusade's leader Boniface of Montferrat quickly accepted. The crusade would march to Constantinople and restore the young Alexius to his rightful place on the Byzantine throne.
One key thing to remember that lay behind the Fourth Crusade was that there had been tension between the world of Byzantium and the world of Western Christendom for centuries. Ever since the First Crusade, some crusaders had found the Greeks effeminate, rubbish in warfare and rubbish at going to fight the Saracens over in the Holy Land where the crusaders were initially meant to go. And this was compounded by the fact that the Byzantine Church had slightly different practices to that of the Western world. When the crusaders arrived here and saw the marvels of this city, they also saw that these were people who did things a different way. And to an extent, there was of course an element of culture shock and intolerance between these two worlds as well. When the Fourth Crusade arrived at the walls of Constantinople, they were faced with a city unlike any other that they had encountered before in the West. A city of over 400,000 souls dwelt within these walls, built by the Emperor Theodosius way back in the latter days of the Roman Empire. Along the walls were 96 towers, and the walls themselves had 3 separate layers of defence, an almost impregnable fortress against any kind of attack. And in fact, Constantinople had never before fallen to the siege of any particular invader. Constantinople was blessed with a large natural harbour called the Golden Horn, which we're on now, you can see behind me. But this also made it very vulnerable to attack from the sea. And once the chain that was placed across the Golden Horn from Galata, the side that the Italian merchants colonised, to the city itself, once that chain was broken, the Venetians, with their superior naval power, were able to break through and attack the walls in a large-scale assault. The first plan of attack was an ambitious amphibious landing on the shores of Galata. You can see the Galata Tower behind me. This was home to part of the chain that was stretched across the Golden Horn to stop ships getting in to Constantinople's harbour. Once Galata Tower was taken, it was taken quite easily because the Byzantines there surrendered to the Venetians and the Franks who had come across from the shores of the Adrian side. The attack split into two, and the Venetians began to attack Constantinople by sea, coming across the Golden Horn in their ships and putting onto their masts large siege towers so they could get more easily onto the walls, the sea walls of the great city itself. The strength of the Latins was, of course, on land. With their great chargers that they'd brought across from Europe, they mounted an attack on the walls on the northern side of the city, laying siege to the palace of Blachine itself, one of the imperial palaces, one of the two imperial palaces in the city. What happened next was destructive to all inside the walls of Constantinople.
As soon as the Crusaders arrived, they began to take positions around the northwest corner of the city. The Venetian fleet attacked the city's sea walls from the Golden Horn, but were beaten back under the cover of a huge fire that was started in the city. The Emperor Alexius, the one inside the city, rallied the Byzantine army to meet the Crusaders, but, losing his courage to fight in a pitched battle, he brought the army back into the city and fled. The following morning, the city was opened to accept the exiled Alexius from the Crusader camp. On August 1st, 1203, this Alexius was crowned inside the city as Alexius IV of the Byzantine Empire.
Now the Crusaders seemingly had their man inside the walls of Constantinople.
But the position of Alexius IV was a fragile one. It quickly became clear to the Crusaders that Alexius was unwilling to fulfill his promises to them now that he was in power. What's more, the Byzantines in Constantinople were clearly unhappy with their new emperor. In the spring of 1204, a Byzantine general known as Murzaphilus poisoned Alexius and his father Isaac, who had also been blinded earlier, by the way. Murzaphilus had himself crowned emperor with the support of the citizens of Constantinople. He now needed to act quickly to shore up his position against the large army of Crusaders that were just outside the city walls.
Murzaphilus did much to strengthen and bolster the support of the Byzantine army. He refortified the walls, adding to these immense fortifications built by Theodosius. In addition to that, 3 spies that were caught from the Venetian camp were hung up on meat hooks on the other side of the wall to try and scare off the Crusaders. Murzaphilus was intent on showing that he was not on the Crusaders' side in order to rally more popular support inside the walls of Constantinople.
Now that their man was out of the picture, the Crusaders had all the justification they needed to launch a full-scale attack on the city. The Doge Enrico Dandolo secured leadership of the crusade and ensured that the Venetians would gain the lion's share of Constantinople once it was taken. It was clear that an attack was imminent. On April the 9th, 1204, the final assault on the city's walls began. The Crusaders' siege engines pounded away for 3 days until, finally, the city's defences were broken and the Crusaders poured in.
What happened next was the sack of Constantinople. Once the Crusaders were through the walls, relics were torn from their posts, churches were burned, women were raped, and hell ensued within these city walls.
Byzantine chronicler Niketas Choniates, an eyewitness in 1204, wrote of the wrathful barbarians that had invaded his city. These people drew their daggers against anyone who opposed them at all or hindered their demands. In the city's most sacred church, Hagia Sophia, the holy altar was broken into bits and distributed among the soldiers, as all the other sacred wealth was so great and infinite splendour was. Even a certain harlot sat in the patriarch's seat, singing an obscene song. Choniates lamented how on earth men could show such madness before God himself.
The Sack of Constantinople lasted for 3 days in that fateful April 1204. Even the tombs of the emperors were not left unturned, as precious gold and silver, precious metal, was melted down and taken back to the west, prize and for booty.
The Venetians gained the best lands from the decimated Byzantine Empire, both in Constantinople and throughout its territories. Much of the wealth that was taken from the city ended up in Venice, the most famous example being the 4 horse statues that were taken from Constantinople's Hippodrome and still adorn St. Mark's Basilica to this day. Hundreds of relics and sacred objects were taken from the city and found new homes in the monasteries and convents of Western Europe. In all, 900,000 silver marks were looted from the city and shared between the Crusaders and the Venetians.
The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered from the sack at the hands of the Latins of Constantinople in 1204. A remnant of the Byzantine leadership did make their way to Trebizond, where they set up a mini Byzantine kingdom and in fact managed to recapture the city from the Latins, who had held it as a trading colony for most of the 13th century. However, this success was to be short-lived, because by the 15th century, by 1453, a new dynasty had risen in the east, the Ottoman Empire, whose Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, laid siege to and captured the city in 1453, renaming it Istanbul, the name of which it still holds today.